Welcome back. This is Raylan Barnes, and I'm here with Dr. Sarah Gold McBride from UC Berkeley.
Hello. Good
morning. And we're going to talk today about the World's Columbian Exposition, or the World's Fair, held in Chicago in 1893. So I take it you are very into the World's Fair.
It is one of my favorite things to teach, yes.
All right, so just set it up for us. What is a World's Fair? Because this was something that people were totally obsessed with, and we no longer are familiar. 27 million people went to this World's Fair. So what happened? What was going on?
Yeah, so a World's Fair, as you said, were these huge, big public events in the United States and Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And the weird thing is that actually World's Fairs still exist today. There was a World's Fair scheduled for Dubai in 2020. I don't know if it's still happening in light of coronavirus, but they are so much less culturally significant in the United States today than they were in their heyday. A World's Fair was a multi-month-long fair held on a fairgrounds with a combination of indoor and outdoor spaces. And they were held in major cities across the world starting in 1851. The very first World's Fair was held in London in 1851, and it was such a great success that other countries began mimicking this format of a big, huge physical space set aside for public events, for visitors from all around the country and really all around the world to attend the event. A World's Fair imagined itself as having a national audience. It was basically an opportunity for the host city and the host country to show off to the world what was great about that place. Mm-hmm. And this was not a sort of hidden message. It was very explicit that the goal of a fair was to show off that place. The United States held its first World's Fair in Philadelphia, but the biggest by far and the most significant World's Fair in the United States was the Chicago World's Fair in 1893.
So does this one have a theme, or what was happening? Why Chicago? Why this moment?
Right. So 1892 was the original planned year for this fair, and that year might ring a bell because it was 400 years after 1492, when Christopher Columbus landed in North America. And so the idea of the 1892 fair was that the United States would get to show off 400 years of progress, essentially, since Columbus's landing. And that's why it's called the Columbian Exposition. It's a reference to this anniversary of Columbus. Now, as is the case with so many public events, this one didn't run on time. So due to the delays in just getting this massive event put up, it was held a year later. So then the year 1893 feels now kind of random, but when we know it was planned for the year before, then we can understand it as this anniversary celebration. And moreover, we can understand why it has this weird name, the Columbian Exposition. Now, many different cities actually vied for the opportunity to hold the World's Fair. It was a competition that among different cities, Washington, D.C., New York City, St. Louis, Chicago, all competed because in the late 1880s, in fact, Congress passed a bill calling for an exposition, a World's Fair that is, to honor the anniversary of Columbus's arrival. And so different cities competed. It's sort of similar to the Olympic process today, the way that different cities, put together a portfolio to say why they would be the best host city. Chicago offered a lot of attractive features to the congressional committee that made the decision. It had a lot of open space. There were 24 different railroad lines that had a terminal in Chicago.
Yeah, trains are huge. They can get millions of people to Chicago.
Exactly. And this is really the trains in general are what put Chicago on the map. Chicago was not a major city before the second half of the 19th century, but because it became this railroad hub, that is what made it that's what really accelerated its growth and made it probably the most significant Midwestern city, or what we would call Midwestern, what our 19th century actors would call the West. Right? So Chicago's function as this railroad hub made it both a prominent city in general, and made it an attractive option for the World's Fair because, as you said, it could bring these millions of visitors there. Chicago also was, from a more local perspective, Chicago really wanted to get the fair because the city had been devastated from a massive fire in 1871. 2,000 acres of the city had been destroyed, hundreds of people were killed. And so from Chicago's perspective, the World's Fair offered this opportunity to show how it had recovered from this devastating fire.
So one thing that's really iconic with the Chicago World's Fair is what they called White City. And this is sort of a moment where we have, for the first time, mass electrification being used as a form of entertainment, as spectacle. I have this little quote that I wanted to share from somebody who walked in and then wrote this when they got home. Quote, "Everything is buzz and clatter and confusion, an unending, everlasting labyrinth of grandeur," wrote Horace G. Benson, a Denver attorney. "I am dazzled, captivated and bewildered, and returned to my room tired in mind, eyes, ears, and body. So much to think about, so much to entice you on from place to place until your knees clatter and you fall into a chair completely exhausted." So,
a passage. Wow.
So what's going on in White City? Because this is really a famous, iconic place.
Yeah, so the White City refers to the main fairground area of the Chicago World's Fair. The fair itself, as you will see on this map we're going to be looking at closely today, the fair itself was largely kind of shaped like a wedge. That's the main area of the fair. And this is the area called the White City. And it was so named because it was this collection of beautiful, huge, classically architecture-style white buildings. Moreover, the whiteness not only spoke to the visual, the color of the buildings in the main area of the fairground. This notion of White City also represented the vision of this part of the fair as a perfect specimen of modern engineering, of craftsmanship, of ingenuity, and of beauty. That it was this symbolic function of whiteness. And if your ears are sort of thinking about race here, that's totally correct.
Yeah.
Because whiteness here doesn't just represent the color of the buildings. It's symbolic of progress and of as I said, of engineering, of craftsmanship, of ingenuity, of technology, and these qualities are very much associated with whiteness. The electricity too is a huge part of this because Chicago was the most electrified World's Fair up to that point. The fair itself used 3 times as much electricity as the entire city of Chicago at the time.
Oh my gosh.
Moreover, it used 10 times as much electricity as the previous World's Fair, which had been held in Paris 4 years earlier. And it was absolutely a competition. Like, this is not just an incidental, data point. Chicago was trying to brag about, look at all this amazing electrical power we have. There were almost 130,000 light bulbs that illuminated the buildings, the grounds, and the waterways at night. And, electricity is something that we take for granted in 2020, especially electrification at night, that you can kind of assume when you're out walking around on the city street at night, there's going to be street lights or other kinds of electrified signs. But electricity was, for many of the World's Fair visitors, a new phenomenon, especially electrification to this kind of scale. So it only added to the grandeur, to as that diarist wrote, to the sort of overwhelming spectacle, the extraordinary feeling of this space.
I know in my classes, there's 2 characters that sort of haunt everything we're talking about, and that's P.T. Barnum and Frederick Law Olmsted. And so Frederick Law Olmsted is the designer of Central Park in New York, and so he's also one of the designers contributing to White City. And so he's also trying to bring this idea that you could have this perfect urban design that would fight, urban decay and sort of the depravity of the city. And I also saw this hilarious quote that the New York Times actually said that, quote, "The travesty was that the late P.T. Barnum should have lived to see this day," because he was all just about, the razzle-dazzle and, merging entertainment and learning, which I know is something that was a huge theme in the White City and at the World's Fair. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask you about would be a man named Frederick Jackson Turner. And then we're going to get into sort of the really juicy things of what's happening at this fair.
I had never thought about it quite that way you just put, but it's true. P.T. Barnum died almost exactly 2 years before the fair opened in 1893, and I'm sure he would have been just bowled over by this place. But you're right, Frederick Jackson Turner is such a significant figure who was in Chicago in 1893. Frederick Jackson Turner was one of the first historians in the United States of the United States. So in the profession of in our profession as historians, Frederick Jackson Turner looms very large. In 1893, alongside the World's Fair, the American Historical Association, which was then and still is now the major professional organization for historians, held their annual conference in Chicago alongside the fair. And at that conference, Frederick Jackson Turner gave the keynote address. And this speech has become so famous in history. It is one of the most significant documents in the history of the United States West in particular. What Frederick Jackson Turner said in the speech was that in 1893, he's standing in Chicago, he's talking to a room of historians, and he starts by talking about the census. Because the 1890 census, whose records had just recently been tabulated, had one really profound finding. That the census declared that the frontier was closed. Mm-hmm. Now, what this means from an 1890 and 1893 perspective is that across all of the land that at that point was owned by the United States across North America, there was a sufficient density of white inhabitants so that there was no more land within the boundaries of the United States that was understood to be, quote unquote, unsettled. That's the word they use, unsettled, meaning not very many white people or no white people living there. So what Turner is saying is, he's looking at the census records. He's saying there is now no more land in the West for white Americans to push into. The entire history of the British colonies in New England, and then all the way up until 1890, basically, was of white Americans pushing further and further west across North America, riding in wagons or coming in steamships and settling in communities, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so from the perspective of 1893, Turner is really worried about this. He says his argument, basically, of his whole speech is that the qualities that make Americans uniquely American, qualities like being very individual and having individual initiative, being able to, what we now call bootstrapping, right? Mm-hmm. Being able to make one's own way, that all of these characteristics are forged in frontier conditions. So Turner is really freaked out. He says, okay, if we don't have a frontier anymore, how will we as Americans continue to develop our unique American character? Mm-hmm. He refers to the frontier as the place where Europeans are turned into Americans. And the lack of this kind of ever-growing frontier is something that he's really concerned about.
I think 1890 is interesting, too, because not just for the census, but we have this moment that historians like Phil Deloria talk about with Wounded Knee, that this is a breaking point for Native Americans as well. And so when you say that this is a significant speech, the Turner thesis, it has its own phrase within our profession.
Yes, absolutely. And what you just said about Native Americans is so key, because of course, when I share the Turner thesis with my students and we read this part where he says, the West is settled, the frontier is closed. And I ask them, okay, who's missing from this picture, right? And it's so obvious to us today that it's entirely ignoring Native Americans. Mm-hmm. The notion that land in what's now California was unsettled, supposedly, before white people arrived is nonsense to us now, right? Because there's Native American people living all over the western half of North America. But from Turner's perspective, who he's thinking about when he talks about American identity is white people. And that, again, is really reinforcing of this vision at the World's Fair of the White City, that the whole purpose of the fair was for Chicago and for the United States more generally to show off what was so amazing about the United States, which was, relative to Europe, a fairly young nation still, just barely 100 years after its founding. And so while the White City was trying to boast about all of the engineering accomplishments and the mechanical accomplishments and the incredible crops that were grown in the US and the art and all these other things, Turner is, alongside in the same city, fretting about whether this progress forward can continue.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting at this moment as well because we have the birth of the Wild West shows, and so the way in which the idea of containment and the West being one is now refracted into entertainment that's happening at this fair. So let's turn and talk about the Midway, the magical place. I am so jealous that I never got to experience this Midway. When people ask me, if you could go back in time, I always cheat and I say I wish film had been invented earlier so I could just watch things. But one thing I wish I could do was actually go to the Midways. So what happens at the Midways and why is this famous and important?
Yeah, so this is the thing, is when we look at this map of the Chicago World's Fair, you notice that most of the buildings are contained in this kind of wedge-shaped piece, and that is the White City. But what we also notice is there's this weird appendage, this thumb sort of sticking out like a sore thumb on the left-hand side of the map, and this is the Midway. And the Midway is basically the polar opposite of everything that was happening in the White City. The White City sent a message of civilization and progress and respectability. These were exhibits that were intended to uplift visitors, to educate them, because the World's Fair, as you said at the beginning, 27 million visitors came to the World's Fair. And scholars who've examined the fair have sometimes even referred to it as the world's universities, the Chicago World's Fair and others, that they were super influential in shaping the way that visitors saw the world around them. So while the White City sent this really this message of progress and civilization and respectability and education, the other side of the fair, the Midway, was basically its inverse. This was a place where visitors were supposed to be amused and where they were supposed to gawk essentially at cultures that were not American. So the Midway was the place where truly uplift gave way to amusement. Even the architecture signals the difference. The White City was a place, as I said, of large classical architecture, huge, beautiful Greco-Roman style buildings. The Midway looked so much more temporary. They're basically like shacks in comparison. The Midway was the place where visitors could, for example, watch trained pigs racing or take a ride in a hot air balloon. It was even the site of the most famous invention of the Chicago World's Fair, the Ferris wheel, which was first displayed at this World's Fair. So the Midway, on the one hand, is the site of amusement. It's the place where, if anyone has ever been to a county fair now, and I grew up going to a county fair. I know you did too, right?
Yeah, we've been to one together.
We've been to one together, exactly. And at the county fair, I think of it a lot more, the ones I've been to, as places with rides and fried foods, and there's a pig race at my county fair. This is the Midway. But the Midway also has this other really important feature, and this is one of the big things that as scholars we really think about is it is a site of exoticization. Yeah. That's a word I always have trouble saying. Most of the space inside the World's Fair was devoted not to things like the Ferris wheel, but to what were called foreign villages. Villages that were paid by visitors would pay to enter. And these were places that showcased basically folk cultures, especially cultures associated with non-white peoples. Again, to contrast these two spaces, in the White City, there were national pavilions that were designed by representatives of foreign nations to show off what was great about those nations. It's a small feature within the overall fair, which is generally all about the United States, but there were some spaces for other countries to show off their prominence as well. In the Midway, by contrast, it's not about showing off. It is about white visitors gawking at these other peoples from other nations. There were villages, for example, for folk German culture, for folk Irish culture, but the big draws were places like what was called Dahomey Village, which was a group of mud huts that housed 70 people who were called native warriors from Africa, who did things like performing a war dance or wear grass skirts or carrying spears. There was also a Samoan village, which advertised that its inhabitants were native Samoans who supposedly participated in cannibalism.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to say, too, the map is somewhat deceptive in scale. This thing is huge. So the Midway alone, 1 mile, 600 feet wide, and it's a Coney Island of the mind. Everything's coming at you from every angle. So I think you've hit on something very important, though, which is really that this is a story about nation states and imperialism in really complex and fraught ways.
Yes. It is a place basically where white visitors could safely gawk at non-white peoples, at cultures from elsewhere in the world. Mm-hmm. And there's, I want to quote here from Robert Rydell. He's probably the expert scholar on World's Fairs. This is what he wrote in 1984 about the Midway. He says, "The Midway Plaisance, a place where Americans, regardless of class, could study ethnography practically," which means not inside of a university or official kind of research setting. He said, in the Midway Plaisance, a place where Americans could study ethnography practically and linking equality to race. Mm-hmm. He said that the Midway provided a quasi-scientific basis for the American image of the non-white world as barbaric and childlike. In this way, he says, too, we can see the way in which the Midway feeds directly into the utopian vision of the white city. I'm going to quote from him again here. "With the forces of mind and light in the white city counterposed with the ignorance, dirt, smells, and matter in the Midway, the white city and the Midway were truly symbolic but not antithetical constructs. Rather, the vision of the future and depiction of the non-white world as savage were two sides of the same coin." Mm. So what he's really captured here is the way in which these villages, the Dahomey village, the Samoan village, and again, there were villages for peoples that were understood in 1893 to be white, like German peoples, but those were not the big draws. The big draws were the villages of non-white peoples in other parts of the world. And what Rydell is capturing here and is so powerful is the way in which these villages allowed ordinary people to not just to do two things at the same time, to gawk at these non-white peoples, and moreover, to learn something about their relationship as white Americans to the rest of the world. It framed white America as this nation on the rise, as this place of progress and civilization and uplift, in direct contrast to the peoples in these villages.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned the Samoan village, and I know that there was also a lot of attention on hula dancers, there's this very clear shift towards sort of Pacific imperialism. The West has been won. We've closed the frontier, so now we have to shift our sights to this greater U.S. imperial power that's global.
Exactly. And it's so telling, again, when I've taught my students about this, we talked about the way in which Turner's thesis, we can see Turner's thesis on display here, basically, exactly what you're describing about the Pacific frontier, the way in which the United States has made it to California, made it to the Pacific Ocean by this point. And so if that frontier is closed, what is the next frontier? Mm-hmm. And this is what American imperialism basically serves, the function it comes to serve. We're in 1893 now, so we're 5 years before the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. would formally become an imperial power, would gain ownership over overseas territories in places like the Philippines. And Hawaii, too, would eventually become an American state, but is subject in the 1890s to lots of meddling by American political and economic elites. So I think you're totally right that, places like the Dahomey village is representing Africa, is representing, sites of exotic imagination from the perspective of white Americans, but a lot of focus is on this Pacific frontier. Mm-hmm. The Midway is, as we've just described, it's two things. It's a place where two things are happening at once. It's about rides and other forms of sort of silly amusement, and it's also about these foreign villages where visitors could gawk at peoples from other parts of the world. And the overall message, again, is the same. They are both sites of low entertainment, essentially, in contrast to the high culture represented by the white city. So places, what's so what's so significant, or one of the things that's so significant about the Midway, as you described, is these new forms of exciting, titillating entertainment. As we've said a couple times already, the World's Fair, over its 6-month period, the Chicago World's Fair welcomes 27 million visitors. And the ticket to enter was only 50 cents, and that is equivalent to about $14 today. So it's not cheap by any means, but it is fairly accessible as a treat, to even working families. And so that meant that people from all different class backgrounds, people from all over the United States, came together in these big crowds at the Midway. So it's really almost like the epitome of this phenomenon that grows over the course of the 19th century, which is being part of an urban crowd. That prior to the 19th century, most Americans didn't experience crowds, that it just wasn't part of daily life. And this is something that for us in 2020 can really take for granted, kind of like electricity. The fact that being in a crowd is so normal to us. But crowds were, by 1890s, more normal, more typical experience, over the previous 60 or 70 years. But crowds enable a lot of different things that are kind of exciting to visitors of the World's Fair. Visitors who might have come from rural places, for a few days, they can experience the excitement of a crowd. And they, some of these excitements are quite titillating. The opportunity to ride in an amusement ride, to ride on a Ferris wheel with an attractive stranger.
Yeah.
The Midway in this way is similar to places like Coney Island that you mentioned earlier, places of amusement where especially teenagers could hang out with each other, interact with each other, maybe sneak away to a darkened amusement ride with each other. It's enabling a new kind of recreation and new kinds of flirting and friendship for young people in particular, away from the historic watchful eye of their parents.
And I think this sudden shift in co-ed entertainment, dating practices, entertainment, this experiencing the crowd and electrification is really dramatized in the mid-20th century movie Meet Me in St. Louis, starring Judy Garland, which is about the 1904 St. Louis exposition. And basically the whole plot is all of the girls are waiting for their men to meet them at the St. Louis Fair, where it's going to be this overwhelming sensory experience, and they're going to fall in love. Also the movie where Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas is released for the first time. So yeah, this basically is like this iconic experience in the 1890s and the early 20th century for teenage Americans in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. And that's such a great comparison to the Meet Me in St. Louis, and it's a reminder that Chicago looms large as a major American World's Fair, but there were other really important World's Fairs all into the 20th century. That the heyday really for American World's Fairs was from the 1870s through about the 1960s, and so all the way up into the 1960s, other cities hosted their own opportunities to show off what was amazing about that place. At the same time, though, all of the titillating excitement that crowds offered, there were also dangers inherent in the urban crowd. And this is, there's a lot of newspaper articles and sort of fretful writing about the dangers of urban spaces all the way back, as early as the 1830s. Expressing concern about the danger that lurks in a place full of strangers who don't know each other. Mm-hmm. And this is really dramatized at the World's Fair in Chicago because it was the site of basically the first American serial killer.
Yeah.
A man named Henry Howard Holmes, who, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes was his sort of popular, his, what do you call it? His, not nom de plume, but his the name he went by. That was not his birth name, I mean to say, but H.H. Holmes, that was the name he became famous with. So this guy goes to the Chicago World's Fair and sets up basically a boarding house where he lures young women who are attending the fair to stay in this boarding house, and then he kills them. When he was finally caught, he confessed to 27 murders, but it's possible that he could have killed as many as 200 people.
It's wild.
And it's totally wild. It's a totally bizarre story. But it's an extreme story, right, of the danger. But it really dramatizes the way in which crowds can be both exciting, but they can also be dangerous.
Sound off in the comments below with your true crime podcast suggestions for the World Fair story. Yeah, no, it's truly one of the most interesting manifestations of all of the very specific fears about what happens in urban spaces, anonymity, sexuality, and entertainment.
Right, sexuality too, absolutely. It's like sexuality can be both like exciting and if you're flirting with a sexy stranger in the Midway, but it can also lead down this extremely scary dangerous path. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so do you want to show us interesting things on this map?
Yes. So I love teaching this map to my students because for one, it's just so visually striking. But what I really like about it is that it's an opportunity for us as historians to remember that maps are constructed objects. Mm-hmm. That just like any kind of text we read or any kind of visual artifact we examine, that these are not neutral carriers of information. That maps, have a very practical function. They convey the location of different buildings and waterways, etc. But they also convey hidden meanings, that they can teach us something about the values of the people who put this map together, and about the values of the place where this map was used. And I think this particular map of the World's Columbian Exposition is really striking in that respect. So the first feature of the map that's immediately obvious is the physical separation of the White City and the Midway. Mm-hmm. The way in which the White City is this fairly coherent body that, it's one mass of buildings right up against Lake Michigan. And then you have this Midway that's like a sore thumb sticking out on the side. And it
looks like a pier almost.
What's that?
It looks like a pier.
Yeah, it does look like a pier, and there actually is a pier. You can see on the other side two different piers sticking into Lake Michigan. And if you didn't know where the water was located, you might think the Midway was itself also a pier.
Yeah.
And it actually reflects the fact that this was the first. So this was the second, as I said, major American World's Fair, but it was the first World's Fair in which amusements like those contained in the Midway were part of the formal fairgrounds. From the beginning, America's World's Fairs had attracted purveyors of amusement. And so outside of the Philadelphia World's Fair, for example, outside of the fairgrounds, where there were sort of unofficial amusement places set up to try to capitalize on the fact that millions of people were coming to visit. But the Chicago World's Fair was the first time these amusements were incorporated formally into the fairgrounds, but it kind of looks like the fair organizers were like holding their noses. They're like,
go over there.
You could be part of the fair, but like just barely on this off to the side. So immediately we see the way that the space is organized conveys messages about these two very different places within the fairgrounds. We can also see on this map the little labels on the orange buildings can signify, or rather speak to the different ways in which the United States was trying to show off what was great about this place. So we see buildings labeled manufacturing, electricity, mines, machines, architecture. There's a stock pavilion to show off amazing like cattle and other forms of livestock. So we can see from the labels on the big orange buildings. They're orange in this drawing, but they were the big white buildings in real life. We can see the kinds of the ways in which the United States wanted to show itself off. We can also see some more tiny details, and here we have to rely on the index. One example is there is a very small women's building. If you look just where the Midway meets the White City, just to the right is a small building labeled the Women's Building.
Got it.
And there was a board of lady managers of women who were there. There was actually a board of all white women who were sort of social elites in Chicago in the 1890s, and they were asked to put together this display specifically to show off the achievements of women. So they get their own very small building for the first time in an American's World's Fair. One of my students actually noticed this next detail. I hadn't noticed it before, is that just below an even tinier building is called the Children's Building. And the fact that the Children's Building is basically like an annex to the Women's Building. And what that signals to us, or what that represents, is the way in which childcare was so synonymous with womanhood in the 1890s. The way in which taking care of children was really not only the job of women, but one of women's primary roles in American life.
Mm-hmm. And also, in some ways, can justify their being in public if it's tied to childhood education and.
Yes, absolutely. That women's earliest public roles were largely in service of a kind of childcare for the nation, in a sense, a kind of public family raising of doing things like intervening in the health of children or children's safety or schooling, a way of being kind of like a mother to the nation. And we see that really visually represented here on the map too. We also can see down in the bottom left corner of the White City the huge railroad terminal. All those sort of wavy lines represent the many, many railroad lines that had their endpoint actually inside the fairgrounds, making it extremely easy for people to come by a train directly into the fair. And that, again, signals the way in which railroad transportation enabled huge numbers of people to attend the fair, and the way that the function of Chicago as this railroad city made it an attractive location for the fair. A few other details. If we really look carefully at the indexes here on the left-hand side, we see an index to different components of the fair. A general index at the top, an index to what's happening on the midway, to the different states. Many different states had a building specific to them to show off what was great about their state. So, for example, my home state of California had and our home state of California, I should say.
Go Bears.
In its display, in the California display, there were huge amounts of produce, for example, to show off the incredible bounty of fresh goods that were available in California, and including a 100-year-old palm tree that was shipped to Chicago specifically for the fair. So we can see an index here about the different states that had their own buildings here in the fair. What also I think is really interesting is if we look below the index to state sites and buildings is the index to foreign sites and buildings. And here it lists foreign countries that were permitted to have a building specific to their own country within the White City. So we see, for example, Great Britain, Germany, Sweden, Colombia, Brazil, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Japan, Norway, a bunch of different foreign countries that had a small space to show off their own what they were producing. And it's really interesting, I think, to cross-reference that list with the Midway list, because the Midway list shows us which countries were being displayed not as paragons of progress in the White City, but instead as sites of folk exotic culture in the Midway.
Mm-hmm. Two places that I would definitely hit up. One, F3, the ostrich farm. Definitely for that. And two, I think is interesting on that's F3. And then F6, the Eiffel Tower model, which I'm assuming is gearing up for Paris Exposition 1900 when the Eiffel Tower is actually unveiled. So was there, I guess one thing that we've sort of been talking about is World's Fairs are also really important in terms of developing iconic architecture that's still all over the world today.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And that's really the Ferris wheel is, it's not the same kind of icon as the Eiffel Tower, but it was definitely
a staple of Americana, though.
It was developed specifically for the fair, and it was supposed to be grand and tall and magnificent in order to boast, for the United States to boast about its manufacturing and electrical and technological capabilities. But it's true too that the architecture of the White City was supposed to be grand, and it was done in this style, that is really familiar to us as this sort of classical architectural style. It was done in that way to evoke classical civilizations to which the U.S. aspired in its values of democracy and republicanism, to make the U.S., which again, it's 1893, and the U.S. is kind of like a baby nation compared to places like France and England. The United States is trying to make itself look like a peer on par with these other nations, and this grand architecture is really part of that story.
In addition to the spatiality, the phrases that are used for naming the places, so you have the villages, but then you have sort of the Japanese bazaar, the Indian bazaar, and so there's ways in which there's sort of this even subtle suggestion of like a chaotic commerce marketplace versus the more sort of refined cultures. So there's sort of this further exaggeration of civilization in that
absolutely
naming.
Yeah, the way that consumption is so baked into all of this. To get into the fair, visitors paid 50 cents, as I mentioned earlier, but that got you entrance into the White City. You could go through all the buildings, you could visit the different, walk on the different walkways. All of the White City was open to you with that 50-cent fee. But if you wanted to enter one of the foreign villages, or if you wanted to ride the Ferris wheel, you had to pay an extra fee. And so there was this kind of pay-as-you-go feature to the Midway that really reinforces the way in which commerce was absolutely underpinning all of this. Whatever it was doing in terms of educating visitors, it was also about making a buck.
I also see on K13 Buffalo Bill's Wild West show.
Yeah.
So I have one last question for you. So, you've talked about how this map is a political document, it's a rhetorical document, it's making very clear arguments, but you've also suggested that the maps and the ephemera and the visual culture themselves become sort of this Pokemon collect them all for people who can't go to the fair in person. So what's happening there with that recirculation?
Yeah, so 27 million is, that's a lot of people, but that's by no means the entire population of the United States. Although we have this, it's incredible that we have this number, that we know the scale of people who attended. We don't know how many of those people were repeat visitors, how many of them were Americans versus foreign visitors. The population of the United States was about 76 million in 1893. And so and scholars estimate that about a quarter of that overall population actually visited the fair. But the majority of the country was able to experience the fair thanks to all these different forms of textual and visual materials that circulated in all across the country, talking all about the fair. Newspaper accounts, guidebooks, and even visual publications. Souvenirs were a huge part of going to the fair. Someone who lived in St. Louis or New York City or San Francisco who wasn't able to physically go to the fair could still experience it from afar by buying a photographic guidebook that would show them vistas of the fair, show them images of the Midway and of the White City, images of the Dahomey Village or the Samoan Village, of different parts of the Midway as well. And so through these forms of ephemera, these forms of guidebooks and souvenir images and photography collections, Americans all across the country could really learn from the fair in the same way that people could when they came in person. By the 1890s, photographic reproduction technology enables this kind of mass circulation of visual images of the fair that simply wouldn't have been possible if the fair had been held a few decades earlier. And so this visual culture of the fair allowed for its messages to be truly nationwide.
Well, thank you so much. This has been an amazing lesson. I've learned so much.